The first thing I remember about that afternoon is the weight of my grandson's head against my collarbone and the way the cardiac monitor above his bed kept finding a rhythm and losing it again. He was 9 years old. 9. He'd come over to spend the weekend the way he did most weekends since my daughter had started traveling for work, and we'd been making pancakes when he said his chest felt funny, and then sat down on the kitchen floor like the strings had been cut. I don't drive fast. I haven't driven fast in maybe 30 years, but I drove fast that afternoon, with him in the passenger seat and my old Buick eating up the miles to St. Anselm's. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the radio was still playing the same oldies station I always had it tuned to, like the world hadn't noticed anything had changed. By the time they got him stabilized and into a room on the pediatric cardiac floor, it was almost 6 in the evening. The doctor, a woman younger than my daughter, told me his condition was something congenital they'd missed at his last checkup, and that they needed to keep him overnight at minimum, possibly longer, possibly for a procedure. She used the word procedure the way doctors do, smooth and neutral, like she was talking about an oil change. I was sitting in the vinyl chair beside his bed, his small hand curled around 2 of my fingers, when my phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. I expected it to be my wife. I'd called her twice on the way to the hospital and once from the parking lot, and she hadn't picked up any of them. That wasn't unusual lately. She'd been busy, she said. The new bridge club, the volunteer work at the Historical Society, the renovation project at her sister's place down in Charleston that kept pulling her away for long weekends. I'd stopped asking questions a while ago. Marriage at our age has a kind of quiet to it, and I'd convinced myself the quiet was a good thing. The message wasn't from her phone. It was from her email sent to mine. I've decided to file. The papers will arrive by certified mail Monday. I've moved the savings in the brokerage to accounts in my name. I've been planning this for a long time, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Please don't make it ugly. Margaret, I read it 3 times. The hospital room was very quiet except for the monitors. My grandson stirred a little and asked for water, and I poured some from the plastic pitcher, and held the straw to his lips, and his eyes drifted shut again before he'd finished swallowing. I typed back 2 words. Understood. Thanks. I hit send before I could think about it. I'm not a man who reacts fast. I never have been. I spent 41 years as a structural engineer, and you don't get to retire from that job by being impulsive. You learn to look at the load, and then the load behind the load, and then the foundation underneath the load. So I sat there as my grandson's hand in mine, and I let the words settle. 43 years of marriage. 2 grown daughters. A house we built together in 1987, the year our oldest was born. A retirement account we'd built up, dollar by dollar through every recession since Carter was president, and she planned it for a long time, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. My phone buzzed again. Not her. A notification from the credit union. Withdrawal complete. $312,400 transferred to external account. Available balance, $1,847.62. I closed my eyes. My grandson made a small noise in his sleep, and I squeezed his hand gently so he'd know I was still there. The thing about being almost 63 years old when something like this happens is that you don't get to fall apart. You don't get the luxury of it. I had a sick child in a hospital bed who thought of me as the second most reliable person in his world, his mother being the first, and I was not about to let the bed shift under him because his grandfather had been blindsided by his grandmother. So I did what I'd done at every job site for 40 years. I started writing things down. I had a small notepad in my jacket pocket, the kind I always carried, and I started the timeline. The date of the email, the amount of the transfer, the reference number on the bank notification, the fact that the brokerage statement I'd received last week had still listed both our names. I wrote down every account I could remember off the top of my head, and I noted which ones I knew were joint and which ones I wasn't sure about. While I was writing, a nurse came in and adjusted something on the IV pump. She asked if I needed anything. I asked if there was coffee somewhere. She told me where the family room was. I thanked her and went back to my notes. Around 9 that night, my daughter called from a hotel in Phoenix. I told her about her son. I told her the doctors were optimistic. I told her not to get on a plane until morning because there was nothing she could do tonight that I couldn't do, and she needed sleep more than he needed her at this exact hour. She started to cry, and I let her cry, and then I told her something else. I told her about her mother. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad." "Oh, Dad." I told her I was all right. I told her I was sitting next to her boy, and he was breathing easy, and the monitors were doing what monitors do. I told her I'd handle it. I told her to be on the first flight she could catch in the morning, and that I'd pick her up at the airport myself. She said, "Dad, did you know? Did you have any idea?" I thought about that for a minute. I told her I didn't know I knew, but maybe I'd known and not let myself see it. That's the truth, as best as I can put it. You don't live with someone for 43 years and not feel the temperature change. You just don't always ask why the room got cold. When we hung up, I sat there in the dim room and I watched my grandson sleep, and I tried to remember the last time my wife had looked at me directly. Not past me, not at the television behind me, but at me. I couldn't remember. It had been a long time. Around midnight, another email came in. This one from a lawyer's office in town. A firm I recognized. They were one of the bigger ones on the square. The kind with their name in gold leaf on a brick storefront. The email was a formal notice. It informed me that my wife was represented by their senior partner and that all communications going forward should be directed through their office. It listed the case number for a divorce petition that had apparently been filed 11 days earlier. 11 days, so she'd filed almost 2 weeks before she'd told me. While we'd had dinner together on Tuesday. While she'd sat across from me on Wednesday and asked me to pass the salt, I forwarded the email to myself at my old work address, the one I still kept active for the consulting jobs I picked up here and there. Then I forwarded it again to a personal Gmail account I'd set up years ago and barely used. Belt and suspenders. An engineer's habit. Then I leaned back in the vinyl chair and I tried to remember the name of the lawyer my old friend Walt had used when his daughter went through her divorce a few years back. Walt had said the woman was tough as boot leather and didn't waste anybody's time. I couldn't remember the name. I made a note to call Walt in the morning. My grandson opened his eyes around 2 a.m. and looked at me and said, "Grandpa, is Grandma coming?" I said, "She's busy tonight, buddy. But I'm here. I'm right here." He nodded and closed his eyes again, and I sat there in the dark and I made myself a promise. Whatever this was going to be, however long it was going to take, the boy in that bed and his mother and his sister were going to come out of it without a scratch. The rest of it, the money, the house, the 43 years, all of that was just paperwork now. I'd been working with paperwork my whole life. My grandson was discharged on Sunday afternoon with a cardiology follow-up scheduled for the following Friday. My daughter had landed Saturday morning and had barely left his side since. I drove them home to her place and helped her get him settled, and then I went back to my own house for the first time in 2 days. Margaret was gone, so were 2 of the suitcases from the upstairs closet and most of her clothes from the master bedroom. The bathroom counter was wiped clean of everything that had been hers. Her grandmother's silver tea service was gone from the dining room hutch. The framed photograph of her parents that had sat on the mantel for 30 years was gone too. But she'd left some things. She'd left our wedding photo. She'd left the photographs of our daughters and our grandchildren. She'd left the box of letters I'd written her when I was stationed overseas the year before we married. I stood in the living room and looked at what she'd taken and what she'd left. And I understood that she'd made these choices carefully. She'd left me the things she didn't want anyone, including herself, to think she'd been cruel about. She'd taken the things she actually wanted. I sat down in my reading chair and I called Walt. Walt is 1 year older than me. We've been friends since we were both new engineers at the same firm in 1986. He picked up on the second ring and I told him what had happened. In plain words, no embroidery. He listened. He's a good listener. When I was done, he said, "Get a pen." He gave me the name of the lawyer, Eileen Halvorsen. He gave me her office number and her cell. He told me to call Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp and tell the receptionist that Walt sent me and that it was urgent. He said Eileen would understand. He said Eileen would understand. He also told me not to talk to Margaret. Not a word, not a text, nothing. He said the first instinct people have is to want an explanation, and he said the explanation isn't coming and chasing it will only cost you money. I thanked him. He told me to come over for dinner on Wednesday if I felt like it, and to bring an appetite. His wife, Joyce, he said, was making pot roast. Monday morning I called Eileen Halvorsen at 8 a.m. By 10, I was sitting in her office with a manila folder full of every financial document I had been able to pull together overnight. She was in her late 50s, sharp-faced, with gray hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her office smelled like old books and a candle that someone had lit and then forgotten about. She read through my notes without saying anything for almost 20 minutes. Then she set them down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Your wife has a competent attorney," she said, "but she's made some mistakes." "What kind?" "She emptied a joint marital account before the petition was served on you." "That's not illegal exactly, but it's going to look bad to a judge, especially if I can show that the funds were transferred to an account that isn't entirely in her name." I leaned forward. "You think there's someone else?" She took her glasses off and let them dangle. "Mr. Wexler, there's always someone else. Pardon my saying so. But in 40 years of doing this work, I have seen exactly 4 cases where a long-term marriage ended with a planned exit and a planned financial maneuver, and there wasn't a someone else. 4. So I'd say the odds are not in favor of this being about her finding herself." I sat with that for a moment. "What do we do?" She put her glasses back on. "We slow it down. We file a response that asks for full financial disclosure. We file a motion to freeze the marital assets pending discovery. We do not engage with her, and we do not engage with her lawyer outside of formal channels. And then we wait, and we watch, and we let her show us what she's been doing." I asked her what it would cost. She told me. It was a number that would have made me wince a year ago, but I had a son-in-law who was a CPA and 2 daughters who loved me, and a grandson who'd just been in a hospital bed. And I understood with great clarity what mattered and what didn't. I wrote her a retainer check from the personal account she didn't know about, the one I'd kept since before we were married, because my own father had told me at 22 never to be a man without his own money in his own name. That was advice I'd half followed and half ignored for 40 years. I'd kept the account. I'd never put much in it, but I'd kept it. That night, I made myself a sandwich and ate it standing up at the kitchen counter, and I thought about my father, who'd been dead almost 20 years. And I thought about how much of what he told me I'd shrugged off because I thought I knew better, and I felt a kind of late, grateful warmth toward him that I hadn't felt in a long time. The next 2 weeks were quiet on the surface and very busy underneath. Eileen filed her motions. The court granted the asset freeze faster than I'd expected, which Eileen said was a good sign. My daughter called every night to update me on her son, who was improving. The cardiologist had decided he didn't need surgery after all, just a medication and monitoring. My other daughter, the one out in Oregon, flew in for a weekend just to sit with me, which was something she'd never done before, and which I will remember for the rest of my life. Margaret tried to call me twice in those 2 weeks. Both times I let it go to voicemail. Both times she didn't leave a message. The third time she sent a text. "Can we talk like adults?" I forwarded it to Eileen and didn't respond. Eileen wrote back a single line. "Good. Keep doing that." Her sister called me on the second Friday. Her sister, who'd hosted those long weekends down in Charleston. I'd always liked her. She was a year younger than Margaret, and she'd always seemed to me like the warmer of the two, though I'd never said that out loud. "I want you to know," she said, "that I had no idea about any of it until 2 weeks ago." I said 2 weeks ago. She called me. She told me what she'd done. She told me what she'd been doing for the last year and a half. "I'm sick about it. I'm so sorry." I was quiet for a minute. Then I said, "I appreciate you calling." "I do, but you don't owe me anything, and I don't think you should put yourself in the middle of this. She's your sister." "She's wrong," her sister said. "She's my sister, and she's wrong." I thanked her again, and we said goodbye. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while afterward. The someone else turned out to be a man named Curtis. He was 61, divorced, ran a small marina down on the Gulf Coast. Margaret had met him through the Historical Society 3 years ago at some kind of fundraising weekend in Savannah. Eileen's investigator put together the timeline. Margaret had been traveling to see him for the better part of 2 years. The renovation at her sister's place down in Charleston had been real, but the long weekends had mostly not been Charleston. They'd been Pensacola. What Eileen found that mattered, though, wasn't the affair. It was that Margaret had used about $40,000 from our joint account over the past 18 months to put a down payment on a condo in Curtis's name. The deed was in his name alone. The money had come from ours. She'd routed it through 3 transfers to make it less obvious, but the trail was there if you knew to look for it, and Eileen's investigator knew to look for it. "That's marital waste," Eileen said when she called me with the news. "It's textbook. A judge is going to take that money back out of her share of the settlement. And it's going to make every other claim she makes look worse." I asked her what it meant practically. "It means she's going to come down off her position. Probably soon. Her lawyer's going to see this and tell her she's overreached. She thought she could get away with the savings transfer because you'd be too overwhelmed to fight back. She thought wrong." I told Eileen thank you. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, and I looked out the window at the dogwood tree in the backyard that Margaret had planted in 1991, the year our youngest started kindergarten. The tree was almost as tall as the house now. It had survived an ice storm in 2014 that took down half the trees on the block. I'd helped Margaret stake it after the storm. We'd worked together for a whole Saturday morning getting the supports right. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I didn't feel like I was winning anything. I felt tired and old and a little ashamed of how much I hadn't seen. And underneath all of that, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was relief. A long, slow relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for years without realizing you'd been holding it. The settlement negotiations started about a week after that. Margaret's lawyer made a first offer that Eileen described to me as a fishing expedition. We countered. They countered back. Eileen warned me that this would take months, possibly the better part of a year, and that I should prepare myself for the long game. It didn't take that long. It took about 10 weeks. In the end, Margaret took her clothes and her grandmother's silver and a fair share of the retirement accounts, but not the share she'd taken on her own. The condo money came back out of her share. The house came to me because we'd agreed early on that neither of us wanted to fight about that. The brokerage account was split closer to evenly than she'd originally tried to make it. I kept enough of the savings to know I wasn't going to spend my 70s eating cat food. My grandson came over the weekend after the papers were finalized. He was doing well by then. The medication was working. He'd been cleared to play soccer again, gently, with his mother watching from the sidelines like a hawk. He sat at my kitchen table eating the pancakes I'd made, and he said, "Grandpa, where's Grandma's teacups?" He meant the silver. He'd liked it because it was shiny, and he'd always begged to be allowed to hold the little Toms. I said, "Grandma decided to take those with her when she moved." "Where'd she move to?" "A long way away, buddy. Down by the water." He thought about that for a while. He chewed his pancake. "Are you sad?" he said. I thought about how to answer him honestly. I have always tried in my whole life to answer my children and grandchildren honestly. Not all the truth. They don't need all the truth. But the part I tell them, that part should be true. "I was sad for a little while," I said, "and then I figured out that I'd been sad for a long time before any of this happened, and I just hadn't noticed. So now I'm working on being not sad, and I think I'm getting there." He nodded like that made sense to him. Maybe it did. Kids understand more than we give them credit for. I don't know what to tell you about Margaret now. I don't see her. We exchanged a few logistical emails after the settlement about a storage unit and some books of her father's that had ended up in our attic. The emails were polite. There was no warmth in them, but there was no cruelty either. I think we'd both used up whatever we had to say to each other a long time ago, and the divorce just made it official. I heard, through Walt, who heard from a mutual friend, that things with Curtis didn't last. About 6 months after she moved down there, I don't know the details and I haven't asked. I don't wish her any harm. I really don't. I hope she finds whatever it was she was looking for. I just hope she finds it somewhere I don't have to watch. What I do mostly these days is this. I keep the house up. I do my consulting jobs when they come in. I drive my grandson to his cardiology checkups when my daughter can't get off work. And I sit in the waiting room with him and we play tic-tac-toe in the back of an old receipt I keep in my wallet just for that purpose. I have dinner with Walt and Joyce every other Wednesday. I read a lot. I'd forgotten how much I used to read before I let other things crowd it out. I bought a small fishing boat last spring. Nothing fancy. A used aluminum Joan boat with a 15-horse motor that needs a little coaxing on cold mornings. I keep it down at a friend's dock on the lake. My grandson and I go out in it on weekends when the weather is right and we don't catch much, and we don't talk much, and it's some of the best time I've ever spent. A friend asked me a few months ago whether I was angry. He asked it the way men our age ask each other things, sideways while we were both pretending to look at something else. I told him the truth. I told him I had been angry for a while in the first month or so. Not screaming angry. I'm not built for that. But a low, steady, banked anger. The kind that doesn't burn but doesn't go out. And then somewhere in the middle of all the paperwork and the depositions and the long evenings with my own thoughts, the anger had thinned out and turned into something else. Not forgiveness exactly. I'm not there yet, and I may never be. But something quieter, an understanding that the woman I'd been married to for 43 years had been a different person at the end than she'd been at the beginning. And so had I. And we just stopped being people who fit together a long time before either of us was willing to say so out loud. She made her choices. I made mine. The choices weren't equal, and I want to be clear that I don't think they were. She did a thing that was wrong, and she did it in a way that was calculated to hurt me as little as possible, only because hurting me as much as possible would have cost her more. That's a hard thing to know about somebody you loved. But it's the truth, and I'd rather have the truth than the version of things I was living with for the last few years of our marriage. If you've listened to me ramble on for this long, I want to leave you with one thing. Not advice. I'm not in the business of giving advice. Just an observation from a man who has lived long enough to be wrong about a lot of things. When you find out that someone you trusted has been planning their exit, the first thing your gut will tell you to do is chase them. To demand an explanation, to beg or yell or fix it. Don't. Just don't. Sit down. Get a pen. Make a list. Call somebody who loves you and tell them what happened. Plain and simple. And then call somebody who knows the law and let them do their job. The world will keep turning. The grandkid in the hospital bed will get better. The dogwood tree in the backyard will bloom again next spring. And one morning, maybe a year from now, maybe 2, you'll wake up and realize you've been sleeping through the night again, and you didn't even notice when it started. That's what I've got. That's the whole of it. If anything in here landed for you, I'd be glad to know where you're listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you feel like it. And if you want to come back next time, I'll be here. I've got a few more stories left in me, and the coffee's always on. I've thought a lot, in the months since all of this settled, about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in some grand cosmic sense. I don't have the temperament for that kind of thinking, but in a plain, practical way, the way an old engineer looks at a building that fell down and tries to figure out which beam gave first. Margaret made her choices over a long stretch of years, and every choice she made narrowed the next one. She decided early on that the truth was something to be managed rather than spoken. She decided that a quiet weekend in Pensacola was easier than a hard conversation at her kitchen table. She decided that moving $40,000 in small transfers would be cleaner than asking me directly for a divorce. Each one of those choices felt small to her at the time, I'm sure, but small choices compound, the same way interest does, and by the end, she'd built herself into a corner she couldn't get out of without somebody noticing. The condo in another man's name was the beam that gave first. He was always going to give. She just didn't see it that way until a judge did. What I did differently, and I want to say this without pride because I don't feel any, was that I sat down. I got a pen. I called Walt, who'd been my friend since 1986, and I called Eileen Halvorsen, who knew what she was doing. I didn't chase Margaret. I didn't beg for an explanation. I didn't put anything in a text message that I wouldn't want a judge to read out loud. That's not cleverness. That's just the discipline you pick up when you spent your whole working life knowing that the foundation matters more than the paint. The other thing I learned, or maybe relearned, is that a man's character isn't tested by what he does when he's winning. It's tested by what he does at 2 a.m. in a hospital chair with his grandson's hand in his and his savings account at 0. You either keep showing up for the people who need you, or you don't. There's no middle ground. My grandson didn't need a grandfather who was falling apart. He needed a grandfather who was there. So I was there. The rest of it, the paperwork, the lawyers, the long phone calls, all of that happened around the edges of the only thing that actually mattered, which was a sick child who needed me to be steady. If there's anything I'd want a younger man to take from my story, it's this. Be honest with the people you love, even when it costs you. Keep some of your money in your own name, not out of distrust, but out of plain good sense. And when life knocks the wind out of you, don't waste your breath screaming. Save it for the long walk back.